Hello, everybody. Thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. Today with me is Daniel McAdams, the co-host. And Daniel, good to see you today.
Good morning, Dr. Paul.
Well, good. There was a little debate last night, and I know you stayed up and watched it diligently. I have to confess that I did. I had good intentions. I sat down, and I was going to watch that thing and do my homework, but for some reason, I snoozed off, so I decided there must be something more productive. But it isn't hard to catch up on things, you know, and what they debated. And, of course, one thing I was interested, as you are always on, is on the foreign policy. And I know this is vice presidents, and they're not too important. You know, sometimes you can have a vice president like Daniel Quayle, and who remembers, you know, about him and what role did he play. But then people can remember Dick Cheney.
Yeah.
He was almost like a president. He certainly was president and the individual that steered foreign policy. So that is pretty important. But I was just stopping to think and wonder, you know, what are the odds of one of these guys becoming president? They might be a pseudo-president, have a lot of influence. They might not be too important, but there's always a chance something happens. And it's surprising that, you know, a significant, when it comes to percentages of American citizens die in office. So it's like 18% of the American presidents end up the vice president taking over.
That's pretty significant. That's eight people have become president. And you don't usually, as you say, you think of a vice president being sort of an adjunct, but
you know, but that's the reason why I think the debate was important. And of course, I work on the assumption, which I believe is correct, that there's not a dramatic difference between the two. People will give me more argument because obviously Donald Trump is different than Hillary. But, you know, the people they pick make an important thing. You know, I had very, very high hopes for Ronald Reagan, but a lot of people were very disappointed when he picked George Bush, who didn't represent anything that Ronald Reagan had talked about. So I think the people they pick are a reflection of the candidate's opinion. So people that Hillary picks, I think you can expect something. But also, if Trump picks somebody and he happens to be very, very close to the neocons, I don't think that's an accident. I think that we have to pay attention to that. And I think that came out in the debate last night.
Yeah, it almost becomes comical when both sides agree on a hawkish foreign policy, on a neoconservative foreign policy, American exceptionalism, because what they're forced to do is descend into almost schoolyard taunts. You know, and here's one example that from last night. You know, Pence was trying to say that Hillary Clinton and the Obama administration's weak foreign policy. He says, situation we're watching hour by hour in Syria is a result of the failed foreign policy and weak foreign policy that Hillary Clinton helped lead in this administration. And Tim Kaine's response was not to challenge that, but to say, you guys love Russia.
Yeah.
And then he said, he said to the audience, he loves dictators about Trump. He's got a kind of personal Mount Rushmore: Vladimir Putin, Kim Jong-un, and Muammar Gaddafi. It's
you know, and you know what bothers me is there's never a challenge to policy. You know, they're not non-intervention, they're interventionists, but they have to have a contest going on to satisfy the media and to satisfy the voters that there's really a big conflict here. But it's just a variation in tone, a variation in interventionism, and to say that Hillary personally herself, you know, created all these monstrosities. She contributed a lot, but it was the policies of Republicans and Democrats endorsing, you know, intervention. So even when you have a Democratic president, and especially when you have a Republican Congress, they have to support it. But now the big complaint here from the Republican side is that they're not tough enough, not mean enough. They don't drop enough bombs. In Syria, we should send more troops in. It's not questioning whether it's even wise to be there. So you never hear this, and there's this big contest. What about the lack of a contest or discussion about a no-fly zone? We've talked about about that, and it mainly was Hillary that was pushing that. So what do the Republicans really want? Do we have a vice president that's going to have an influence and move it along? He certainly is on the side of a lot of powerful people, the media and everybody else, the military-industrial complex. Yeah, they want this type of thing, and yet we've heard something in a different tone with Trump. But then again, Trump's responsible for picking the people. Yeah. I keep thinking about, what if I had staff people back in my office that started writing all these crazy memos that contradicted everything I believed in?
You may have had one or two. Thankfully, they didn't last too long.
No, they don't last long. But it just seems like that's conventional. It's all more or less to try to confuse the voter.
Yeah, it's a great example of the no-fly zone, because that's been the centerpiece of Hillary's foreign policy, no-fly zone in Syria. And so here Pence comes out, and Trump has not been specific, but Pence comes out last night and says, no-fly zone for Syria. So they're having a war over something they agree with. Yeah. But the one thing, as you point out, they don't understand the policy, because there's a huge difference between a no-fly zone and a please no-fly zone. Because a please no-fly zone would say, we'd rather not have you fly over this area. But a no-fly zone means that you have got to take out the air defense system of the Syrians and the Russians in Syria. You've got to bomb airfields. You've got to have an extensive, probably week-long bombing campaign against Syrians and Russians. And you know, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs was before Congress last week, and one senator was puffing himself up saying, why can't we have a no-fly zone over Syria? And the general said, because we would have to go to war with Syria and Russia. You know, that's what it would entail. And it never enters into the discussion. It's just about chest puffing.
Yeah, they brought up the Syria and the Ukraine. And of course, who's the biggest aggressor? Who's the bad guys? And of course, everybody has to agree that Russia's the bad guy and that we're saints. And to argue anything differently, to suggest maybe there's a strategic and moral justification for somebody doing something near their borders versus somebody going 6,000 miles away, and because they're the policemen of the world and they have to surround countries like Iran and Russia. There's a big difference, but they want to turn that around and say, "Oh, you're soft on the dictatorships." They were, when Kane attacked Pence on dictatorship. Well, what is the history of this country? It's sickening on how many times we have supported. Just think of how many dictators we propped up, and then they committed crimes. It was in Cuba and Panama and Iran, and then finally things turned the tide, and we don't like dictators, and then their pretense that we're on our high horse and say we don't like it, and they're trying to find out who's the most moral now. But that's all, from my viewpoint, it's just political grandstanding. It has nothing to do with our role in the world. They both agree that we have this ominous role to be the policeman of the world, to have bases all over the place. And how many times did the subject of money come up last night? I couldn't find anything to say, maybe we could have more wealth in this country. Maybe if people need more things, if we left that money in the economy, people would be wealthier here. But Republicans, Trump, and Pence, they all want to spend more money. And the Democrats have never pretended that they wanted to cut anything. Oh, they're less militant. That's a bunch of baloney. Hillary is sad. She, matter of fact, right now, if you look at the numbers, she has more neocon support than Trump. Yeah. But Trump still has neocon support. So I think the deep state protects their interests, and it doesn't sound like that. It sounds like you get independent candidates, but the deep state is always involved. I think they were definitely involved with the Reagan administration, and I think they've been involved, throughout, and they're going to be involved. And I think, of course, the Bush family is being very much involved in the deep state and have their finger in just about everything. But what do we have now? We have the leaders of the Republican Party, like the Bushes, and they're flocking to Hillary. and people say, oh, no, there's a big difference between the Republicans and Democrats. It turns out it's disgusting. It's almost like a farce.
Yeah, it is. And the sort of the caricaturization of Putin as some sort of, it was Hillary that said he's the new Hitler, that Putin is the new Hitler. And everyone knows how it goes. If they said if you'd taken out Hitler early, wouldn't have had all of this. So the assumption is there, you make the connection. The other thing about the Russians being in Syria that people don't talk about, obviously they didn't talk about it last night, but there are literally thousands of Russians from the Caucasus who have flocked to Syria to learn jihad, to learn how to do these things. And that's always been a difficult problem for Russia, how to manage those parts of Russia where you do have a lot of radical Islam. And so they're going to see these guys coming back home in the thousands causing trouble. So they do have a real reason to be concerned, as we would if we were next door to, for example, in Mexico, if something like this was happening.
Well, I think the war drums are beating, and a lot of people would like to ignore them and think that one side is better than the other on foreign policy. I don't believe that to be true, but the Army Chief of Staff this week made a statement, Mark Milley, and he said, we must destroy Russia. They are the aggressors. They're at fault for everything. And they're mainly talking about, the defense of a naval base next door that they've had a treaty with, but we decided Assad had to go. And also the Crimea, and that has a long convoluted history. And it'd be sort of like, I think an analogy might be that somebody on a moralistic basis, they could make the case, but how well would we tolerate, making sure that we have no access to any bases in the Philippines or, in Japan or anything? Someday that is going to end, but we just accept that as routine. But if another country does, I think distances make a difference. When you mentioned Mexico, if you're dealing with threats in Mexico, next door, Cuba, I think is a little bit different. But if we're going to so many places around the world, 7,000 miles from us, and just looking for trouble and threatening people, but I just think that I can't believe the people who do this want the war. I know they want to sell weapons and things like this, but I think that what they don't realize is that they can get out of control. Maybe they want just a modest confrontation, but it's too often gets out of control and it ends up into a real hot war.
And again, you have the low information. You have the mainstream media that doesn't give information. It only propagandizes. Because Crimea was part of Russia longer than California has been part of the U.S., It was part of Mexico. So this whole idea, and the other thing about Crimea is that if they really were under force, under siege, you'd be seeing some social unrest there. The people they're almost 100% Russian. They speak Russian.
Well, the other thing right now about the acceleration of the war drums beating is that we're supposed to be on Russia's side. We try to pretend we are, and then the agreements fall apart. We're both against ISIS, yet we help ISIS, and yet we're against Assad, and the Russians like Assad. So we say, well, we're going to start bombing. We were tired of all this. We're going to get rid of Assad. He's crossed the red line. And, Trump's beating the drums. Pussyfoot around, be tough. So it looks like the administration, they have a very strong chief of staff in the Army, be very, very strong. But what about these missiles? I mean, this sounds like escalation. The Russians have missile near Syria, the S-400s, which are very effective, but they literally put S-300s. The shipments are noticed, and those are anti-ballistic missiles. And, of course, the United States, more aggression, we have to do something. But the statement is that these are purely defensive weapons. If nobody bombs the government of Syria, they don't need to worry about it. And, of course, we're yelling and screaming because we want to bomb. We want to bomb and we want to escalate. And at the same time, we're encouraging ISIS to join us in trying to defeat Assad. We'll take care of ISIS later on. They're just they're sort of like we were going to take care of the Mujahideen that turned into the Taliban, and we're still fighting that war.
Well, you're right, because there was a piece, I think it was yesterday in the Washington Post. I think Josh Rogan wrote it. He's a big neocon writer and a big favorite. But he points out that and here's the title, U.S. military strikes against Assad are back on the table. And he's talking about the U.S. is seriously considering starting to bomb Assad. And so over here you have the Russians and Syrians getting defensive weapons. Why is it so absurd to do that when you're openly threatening? But here's something that caught my attention in the article. The CIA and the Joint Staff have said that the fall of Aleppo would undermine America's counterterrorism goals in Syria. And if you back that statement up a little bit, Aleppo, we know from Colonel Steve Warren, who's a Pentagon spokesman, Aleppo, the eastern Aleppo, is controlled by al-Qaeda. So how would the fall, i.e. the defeat of al-Qaeda in Aleppo, how would that undermine our counterterrorism efforts? It literally does not make sense.
Unfortunately, a lot of people don't even know where Aleppo is, and we have trouble figuring it out. But, we were talking just in generalities about vice presidents, and that there were eight presidents have died in office and half died by assassination. But there were some where it was significant on foreign policy. Yeah. Of course, when McKinley was shot, Teddy Roosevelt took over. And this wasn't major, but he was also a lot more aggressive with foreign policy in Central America and South America. So it did have an effect. But FDR died in office, and we had Truman. You say, well, war was over and things were done. But a big event occurred under Truman, and he actually challenged a lot of military people, including Eisenhower, bombing the Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Yeah. So it does have an effect. But what about the most recent one, the change? I think philosophically this is the biggest change that occurred, and it was just because of events, and that has to do with the Kennedy assassination, which I quite frankly think the CIA was probably involved in that. But LBJ was the vice president for political reasons, but Kennedy was hated by the CIA, and it had to do with the Bay of Pigs and ultimately the embarrassment of the Dulles brothers, especially Allen Dulles. But then they got LBJ. Kennedy, and I think Vietnam was part of that too. Kennedy didn't want to escalate. He was tired of it all, and even though he participated in it, he finally, I think he got an education those few years he was there. He decided that he didn't want to do this, which was a threat to the establishment and, the control of what was going on. So what did we get? We got LBJ. And look at the disaster there that continued even into the Nixon administration. So vice presidential candidates and vice presidents can be very significant.
Yeah, absolutely. And those are great examples because you'd be inclined to say, well, what's the big deal? There's just vice presidents. But you mentioned Cheney early on, too. And I think everybody would admit that Cheney was the George W. Bush foreign policy. He was the conduit for all the neocons, the conduit for all the wars and the aggression. So he was, as you said, almost a co-president.
And even though he had the greatest influence in prior running things, obviously those were the plans, and George W. appointed him, picked him out, and nothing was said. And matter of fact, it seemed like it was smooth sailing until they lost the war, until they continue to lose the war, until we continue to suffer from the consequences. But they can point out strategy, the failure of strategy, not enough troops, but they never say, well, maybe the philosophy of our foreign policy is deeply flawed. And even under the circumstances of 9/11, they never suggest what possibly could be the motivation between individuals that would just kill themselves and sacrifice their whole lives because they want to make a point. They never ask that. It's always, distortion, and they never get down and say, maybe there's something we're doing wrong. Maybe we should have followed the founders' advice about not being the policeman of the world and not being entangled in entangling alliances, not being involved in the European affair. Oh, they'll say things are different now. We live in globalism. We have to be the global cop, and look how much wonderful things we have brought about in the world.
One of the things that you said in one of your presidential campaigns, and I can't quote it, but it made a real impression on me because the issue here is weakness versus strength. oh, your weakness, I would be strong, I would be stronger. And I remember, I'm sure you'll refresh us, but you said sometimes the greater strength is the strength to avoid the strength to push back when you're being told to do.
Yeah, because the pressure is great, because they paint you so badly. Nobody likes to be painted as un-American and a weak to national defense.
Wimp,
No, I think the pressure is very great. And as a matter of fact, it's much easier to go along with the propaganda. Mm-hmm. If the members of Congress are a little weak on going to war, like they were before the Iraq War, they get their strength by the war propaganda. And we talked about that just recently. They build up the war propaganda, and then the people change their mind and accept it, and then the people can go home and talk about it, and the people will accept it. So I think that, yes, standing up to public pressure is probably more difficult for a president than just going along. But hopefully the attitudes of the people that put pressure on the president would be more positive, and occasionally we have that, Victor, because even though we're on the verge of bombing Assad again, remember a couple of years ago, public pressure made Obama back off. But I think the major thing that the people have to realize is that you're not getting two choices, and we don't have somebody out there talking about non-intervention, which is what we really need. The argument is always tactical, and strategy is not considered to change a foreign policy. Nobody really is concerned about that. And I think the debate last night was certainly typical of that, because they deep down in their hearts agreed on a lot of things. They just say, well, you should be tougher. You should bomb sooner. You should use more troops. And you don't like the right dictators. You're too friendly with this dictator. We like our dictators. And we like these special interests. But when it comes down to neocon influence in our foreign policy, I don't see any difference. There's been some hope that the neocons would have less influence in a Trump administration. I hope that's true. I don't know whether it will be true, but I do know that there's a lot of neocons have lined up with Hillary, and the neocons are generally thought to be more Republican. But there are neocons with Trump too. So what are you going to believe? And then you have to look at vice presidential choices and the people surrounding people. They are significant because they make personal choices on those individuals. If that is the case, we still have a lot of work to do to talk about non-interventionist foreign policy and a policy designed for national defense rather than for policing the world. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.